It didn't come my way. Well, morning everybody. To turn out on such a cold morning from however far you've had to come, and to come and share some thoughts about education. As you will have seen from Barry's introduction, I'm an academic. I'm a cognitive scientist, that's what we're called these days. Worked a lot of my life in universities. Published books on creativity. There's one of my books called Harebrained Tortoise Mind that John Cleese said somewhere or other, called it The Essential Guide to Creativity. So practical as well as academic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a research project that I and my colleagues, my ex-colleagues now at the University of Winchester, did for the OECD about the assessment of what we called creative mindedness in schools. So from my point of view, this debate is about the importance of creativity, and it's about the effect of school on the development of what I'm calling creative mindedness. I don't think, Daisy might disagree with me, that the mentioning of that this being framed as Sir Ken is right means that the debate is a kind of beauty contest about whether we like Ken Robinson or not. That would be a bit of a distraction, I think. I know Ken. Full disclosure, I know Ken. We used to hang out together in a squat just over the road from Euston a long time ago when we were disreputable young people. I know that he's funny, and he's very smart, and he's very well read, and he, like everybody in this room, acts from principle. He believes in and cares about what he talks about, and it astonishes me that people like Ken and others should be subjected to the kind of polarized and rather vicious debate sometimes that at the moment we seem to be only associating with certain young wings of both the Tory and the Labour parties. But that does happen. So I hope that we will conduct this in a kind of pursuit of truth spirit rather than vilifying certain particular people. Okay, let's get off on the right foot in this debate. Of course, not all schools kill all of creativity in all children. We need to try and make sure that we're talking about the real world and not constructing straw men here or there. But the question is more of a general one or a statistical one. Do some schools, as a value judgment, too many schools kill some aspects of creativity? In some children, arguably too many children. Those are the kinds of ways in which we need to phrase the debate. Part of what lurks behind this is, well, two questions. Is creativity important, and what is it? And I want to say a little bit about both of those so that we head off in the right direction. An awful lot of people, from the CBI through to professors of education and psychology at Harvard University and hundreds and thousands and millions of people in between, think that we're, through education, a big part of what we're doing is not just trying to squeeze grades out of them and not just helping them get to the best possible next stage in their education that they can, although we are doing that. We're also trying to give them whatever the resources are that we think they're going to need in order to be able to cope with a world that is pretty fast changing, pretty stressful, pretty complex, pretty demanding, full of opportunity, and also opportunity to go wrong, opportunities to miss their mark. So we need to phrase the importance of creativity in the context of thinking about these multiple objectives for education, preparing all youngsters to flourish in a pretty tricky and turbulent world, and enabling as many of them as possible to get to the best possible next stage in education that they want to get onto. So the question is, are schools doing enough to get the balance right? That would be one of my ways of phrasing the question. Not either or, not this kind of polarized straw man thing about, is it creativity or knowledge? We need to get beyond that, because of course you need knowledge to be creative, and of course young people need both. It's not about setting up these kind of false oppositions. What is, and we need to be clear about, so let me finish that bit. So how we feel about creativity depends on our views of the purposes of education, and from my point of view, a large number of the kids who are destined, statistically destined, not to be winners in the grades game, because we need to keep remembering that the grades game is set up so that there will always be substantial numbers of losers as well as substantial numbers of winners. That's why examination boards keep changing the boundaries to make sure that there's a spread of people who are going to be the winners and the losers. The winners' winnings in terms of GCSE and A-level only have currency because somebody else's children didn't get them. They're rare, they're precious, they're useful tickets for getting through the doors. So we need to keep remembering that. And also where we stand will depend on how we see, and this is a value judgment, it's a philosophical thing, how we see the importance of creativity, of being able to think flexibly, of what's called in many business worlds possibility thinking, not being stumped for a possibility when the world becomes complex on you, whether we see that as being an important, as it were, part of readying youngsters to be able to flourish in the big wide world. But we also need to think a little bit about what creativity is. Ken calls it producing ideas of value, I think. I say it's something like being able to come up with a fresh idea when you need one. And we all do. It's not just about musicians and artists and dancers. It's about product designers and parents and all of us who, when faced with something that is tricky or unpredictable or not normal in terms of our world that we're not yet ready for, we don't get stumped, we don't become helpless, we don't reach for ideas which are not adequate to the challenge, but we have the kinds of minds that will come up with new things. And that needs knowledge and it needs know-how. Nobody is going to deny that those things are important. But it also, as a result of the work we've done and the work we did with the OECD, it also needs a kind of attitude towards thinking, what we called creative mindedness. Creativity isn't a single thing, it's not a single faculty, it's as it like what arises when a certain ensemble of mental skills and habits are working well together. The ones that we identified in this project are, I think they're pretty straightforward and they're pretty obvious. Curiosity, faith in your own ability to ask good questions, to enjoy the process of wondering about things. The wellspring of creativity is a question that you've come up with that matters to you, which you don't immediately have a quick answer to. So it's not something that someone can tell you to do, it's something that is something has to matter to you. Secondly, determination. It's a famous truism about creativity, isn't it? That creativity is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Einstein once said, "There's nothing particularly special about my intelligence or my creativity. I just stay with problems longer than most people." Is that the end completely?
No, you've got 1 minute.
One more minute. Okay, great. Imagination, I've already talked about, is important. Discipline, craftsmanship, seeing an idea through the painstaking process of bringing it to completion so the world gets to know about it. And also collaboration. We identified 6 because creative people are very collaborative people. And getting the balance between those right. So the question is, in your experience, I'm going to ask you to be the jury. As children, maybe your children, go through school, from nursery school to primary school to secondary school, are they becoming more or less curious? Are they becoming more or less confident in their own ability to inquire and to ask good questions? Are they becoming more determined, or are they more likely to give up? Are they becoming more imaginative, more fluent in what they produce? Are they becoming more interested in craftsmanship, in really working at ideas? And are they becoming better collaborators? The evidence tends to go in my direction, but it's down to you. If you think that children are confidently, universally growing in those qualities, then you'll vote for Daisy. If you think there is more that we could and should be doing, then you'll vote for Ken and me. Thank you very much.
It's so different to bang the gavel for people that you really respect, but I'm going to keep doing it. So, on the opposition, speaking against the idea that traditional education kills creativity, Daisy Christodoulou.
Great, thank you very much. There we go. Okay, well, again, to echo Guy, thanks very much everyone for turning out on such a miserable morning. And thank you also, Michaela, for putting this on. I know how busy you are, so to give up a Saturday and get everyone in here and do all the organisation for this, thank you very much. So what I want to do today is I want to talk a bit about the title we have before us, which is Traditional Education Kills Creativity, so Ken is right. And to begin with, actually, I'm just going to get a few points of agreement out of the way, because there are a few points where I not only agree with Sir Ken, but agree with a lot of what Guy has just said. So first of all, I would agree on Sir Ken and Guy's definition of creativity. I think Sir Ken says it's the process of having original ideas that have value. Having a good idea when you need one seems to me absolutely spot on. I would also agree completely with Sir Ken and with Guy that, that creativity is one of the most fundamental and most important aims we can have in education. And I think an education which didn't develop pupils to have creativity, to be able to respond creatively to the problems they're going to face in life, and indeed to appreciate the creativity of others, I think an education that didn't develop all of those things would be a poor one indeed. So I absolutely agree with them on the importance of it. And to get another bit of agreement out of the way, I think Guy's question at the end, are schools doing enough? If you think they are, then go with Daisy. Well, actually, I wouldn't say that either. I would say I agree with Guy that schools aren't doing enough. I think we can do more to develop creativity. And that's where the disagreement comes in, is that I think the methods I'm going to tell you about how we could do more to develop creativity are very different from Sir Ken's ideas about how we could do more to develop creativity. And so I think what the debate really should be about today is not whether or not we think creativity is important. I really hope everyone in the room can agree with that. And not that we shouldn't be doing more to do with it. Again, I hope that everyone in the room can agree with that. What I want the debate to be about is not on the aims, but on the methods. What are the methods we can use to help our pupils become more creative? And that's where I think the fundamental disagreement is. So I don't think that's a straw man. I think that's a real disagreement. Because in everything I've read by Sir Ken, he'll tell you that creativity is innate within us all, and that all school has to do is unleash it. And I'm going to tell you that whilst, yes, we are all capable of creativity, it matters still what's put in. It's not just about the unleashing. And Sir Ken said repeatedly that traditional education kills creativity. You'll know from all his famous TED Talks, he says it's a factory model. That's one of his most famous metaphors, which knocks the joy out of children. Well, again, I'm here to tell you that traditional education is the best method we have available for developing creativity. So first, I think that obviously requires defining another term, defining what traditional education is. And for the purposes of today's debate, I'm going to define it as having two essential features which are vital to developing creativity. So first of all, a traditional education is one where both the child and the teacher are subordinate to the powerful knowledge being transmitted. So it's neither a teacher-led nor a child-led education, it's a knowledge-led education. And secondly, traditional education is based around disciplined and deliberate practice. And I'm going to explore each of those two things in a little more. So first of all, traditional education being knowledge-led, why that matters and why it helps develop creativity. And it's all to do with how the mind works. We know more about how the mind works than we ever did before. And what we know from this is that knowledge really matters. And we know it matters because we know that when we think, when we solve problems, when we're being creative, we depend on working memory and on long-term memory. And working memory is really puny. It's limited to 4 to 7 items of new information at any one time. And working memory you can equate with consciousness. Everything you're thinking about right now is going on in working memory. But long-term memory is vast. We can store tens of thousands of facts in long-term memory. And as a result, most scientists accept that long-term memory is, in the phrase of one of these scientists, it's the seat of all human intellectual power. And in the phrase of another, without it, humans would not be capable of the intellectual feats that as a species we are capable of. And those intellectual feats include some of the creative peaks of humanity, of course. So that knowledge that we have in long-term memory, it's vital for creativity for a couple of reasons. First of all, creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum. New and original ideas build on what's gone before, and Isaac Newton obviously famously expressed this when he spoke about standing on the shoulders of giants. And we need the knowledge of a particular field before we can create and innovate in it. And I think we know this both from our own experience and from the evidence on young children. You'll know if you've taught young children that the pupils who write the most original stories are paradoxically those who know the most stories themselves. We know from all the research and early literacy that the pupils who have heard the most stories, know the most words, are the ones who are really able to flourish and be so creative. So again, knowledge doesn't stifle creativity, it enables it. And second, knowledge stored in long-term memory frees up the precious and limited space in working memory so we can respond in a more sophisticated and creative manner to the world around us. So, for example, if we didn't have knowledge of the phonetic code and vocabulary in our long-term memory, we would struggle not only to write a poem, we'd struggle to appreciate one or to read one or to understand it because we'd be just stuck sounding out the words and wondering what they meant. So, by committing facts to long-term memory, we free up that precious space in working memory to be able to combine ideas, to compare different facts, and to apply the knowledge we have in long-term memory to the new problem in the environment. So we free up the space in working memory to be creative. So again, memorising facts doesn't stifle creativity, it enables it. So that's the first aspect of a traditional education which helps to develop creativity, to focus on knowledge. And second, traditional educations are good for creativity because of their focus on deliberate practice. Now, deliberate practice is a term coined by K. Anders Ericsson. He's one of the most prominent researchers in the field of expert studies, and his work was the basis of much of Malcolm Gladwell's work in 10,000 in Outliers, where Malcolm Gladwell talked about 10,000 hours and how you need 10,000 hours of practice to be good at something. And Gladwell was right, although he did miss some of the nuance, and a particular bit of the nuance he missed was that Ericsson wasn't just talking about any old practice. Mere experience or hours logged don't matter. What matters is not practice, but deliberate practice. And when Ericsson investigated the deliberate practice that experts and trainee, novices are on the way to being experts, the kind of practice that they engage in, he called it deliberate practice because what was interesting about it is that these people often practice it in unlikely or unusual ways. So musicians, for example, don't practice their final concert piece over and over. They pick out particularly difficult parts that they go over and over. They pick out scales to practice. Similarly, footballers don't practice full-sided 11-a-side matches over and over. They do passing drills. So what he saw in a range of different fields was that practice isn't actually about doing the final thing. It's often about doing things which don't look like the final thing, but get you better at it. And that can feel quite counterintuitive. Surely the best way to get better at something is to do it. And what Ericsson's saying is, no, actually, what you need to do is unpick the constituent parts of that final skill and practice those. And that's the role of the coach or the teacher, to design those best courses of instruction and courses of learning, and to get people to do them over and over until they've overlearned them and they're second nature. So this kind of deliberate practice is vital for all experts, and it's vital in education too. And in many cases, as I say, the constituent knowledge needed to become creative doesn't look like the final end product. Asking pupils to be creative is actually not an effective way of developing creativity. So often the things that will help to develop creativity look completely different. And another researcher, Robert Bjork, has put it very well. He said, performance isn't learning. You can be performing and you're not learning. So if we're interested in schools in developing creativity and getting people to be able to be creative, it may not be that we just ask them to do some creative tasks. So let me give an example. A lesson where pupils deliberately practice their times tables on Bruno Reddy's Times Tables Rockstar. It might not look like it's developing creativity, but it is. A lesson where pupils memorise poetry may not look like it's developing creativity, but it is. So developing creativity, I would say, is counterintuitive. It's not always obvious. So I know Guy brought up this idea about the straw man, that actually, Sir Ken's never had a go at knowledge. Is it creativity or knowledge? You've heard Guy say nobody's denying we need both. And he's right, you know, Guy has said repeatedly, we need both, we need to do both. But I think that, and as I've said, I think that creativity is the highest aim of education. So in some ways there are agreements there. But I don't think it is a false dichotomy, and I think the fact we're here having this debate is a sign that it's not a false dichotomy. Because I think whilst there are important points of agreement between us all, and whilst I also absolutely echo Guy's point about the nature of debate, and this is not a debate that should turn into one that's polarised or vicious, because I do think that another area of agreement is that I think Sir Ken and Guy absolutely have the very best aims of the very best wishes of the children at heart. There is a disagreement, and I think the disagreement is not whether creativity is the right aim, but on the correct methods of developing it. I've set out a few examples of how I would set about developing creative writing skill. So I've said doing grammar drills, explicitly learning new vocabulary, memorising poetry, memorising examples of rhetorical devices, and so on. And Sir Ken has explicitly criticised that type of education as belonging to a factory school model. And he said that again and again. He's also said, you know, in plenty of his books, he's talked about the value of project-based learning and how he doesn't like subject-based learning, despite extensive evidence that the real-world projects overload working memory and don't allow for deliberate practice. So the thrust of Sir Ken's argument in his books and in his speeches is that creativity is something that can be developed directly, and it's something that's about being and doing creative things. That if we set up lessons where we require pupils to be creative, that's enough for them to develop creativity. And my argument is that when we look at all the evidence and all the research on this, that creativity is more complex than that. It is not developed directly. Performance isn't learning. Methods which may not look creative on the surface are actually extraordinarily effective at developing creativity underneath the surface. So it's not a false dichotomy. There is some real disagreement. That's why we're having the debate. And I would say the task for you, the audience, is to decide whether you're more persuaded by the claim that we can develop creativity directly, or whether we're better off with perhaps the more subtle methods of the traditional education that I've outlined. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. And now to rebut Daisy's arguments and maybe add some more of his own, back to Guy.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure it's good to hear that we have so many agreements, but I think there really are some differences that we need to iron out. What I didn't hear much of in what Daisy was talking about was about the way we think. I'm not sure if she used the word thinking. She talked about memorizing, but actually the way we work with knowledge and when we work with knowledge are, as Daisy rightly said, intricate and important things. I'm glad we're getting into the guts of the psychology of this, if you like, because it's really important. There's a whiff in what Daisy said that somehow or other you have to fill your what she called long-term memory up with lots and lots of uncritically, accurately remembered knowledge before you can do something else with it. It's like saying you have to have, you know, enormous piles and piles of bricks delivered into your front garden before you can think about the kind of structure that you want to create. Actually, knowledge is embedded through thinking, critical thinking, imaginative thinking, and it's just a misunderstanding of the way our minds work to say that you have to kind of fill your heads up with this enormous pile of unthought about, uncritically accepted, lots and lots of little bits of facts and so on, knowledge, to fill your brain up with that before you can start thinking about them critically or imaginatively. Yes, the way we go about trying to build creative mindedness, as I call it, in young people is a matter of understanding the components or the elements that go to make up creative mindedness. I would be perfectly happy to admit that the ability to retain information in a relatively undigested form, that skill, that mnemonic skill, if you like, strengthening that mental habit, makes a small contribution to creative mindedness. But I don't think it's far and away from making the biggest contribution to that. The things that make a much stronger contribution are the kinds of things that I talked about on the basis of our OECD project. The ability to have your own questions, to think critically about information. I think in schools, I think one of the things that was missing from Daisy's presentation is the realization that the way we teach, not just what we teach, but the way we teach, can have powerfully different effects on the way the growth of young people's minds is being steered. You can teach the Tudors in a way that exercises young people's willingness to be passive, compliant, dependent on their teachers, and uncritical of information that they're receiving. Or you can teach the Tudors in a way that stretches and strengthens their skill and their disposition to be imaginative, to be critical of what they read, to be thoughtful, and to be collaborative. Both of those skill sets will get you, if they're done well, will get you good examination scores. But only one of them will prepare you for a creative life. If you're consistently taught the essence of the argument, which I think Daisy's not yet put her finger on, is what are the kind of mental habits which are being developed by the way we teach in schools. You can teach simultaneous equations in a way that stretches the willingness to experiment, to persist, to struggle in the face of difficulty, and to be imaginative. Or you can teach simultaneous equations in a way that breeds only an instrumental attitude to calculation and an anxiety about making mistakes. Both of those two mental attitudes are antithetical to creativity. But you can teach mathematics in a way that gets good results and also builds the aspects of the mind which are going to serve you well in the rest of your life. Lauren Resnick is one of the 3 or 4 most well-respected experts in the world on the nature of intelligence. She defines intelligence now as the sum total of your habits of mind. And those habits of mind are being cultivated in school. It's that that is crucial, not the accumulation of an enormous pile of bricks on your front lawn. Thank you.
Great, so I think it's good because we are absolutely getting onto the things that we disagree about. So that final thing there is about the habits of mind, not the accumulation of bricks on the front lawn. Guy's told you that actually these accumulation of facts, it makes a bit of a difference, but only a small contribution. And I would say actually the evidence, the research we have from the past half century of research into cognition...
No, I said the skill of memorization makes a difference, not the accumulation of knowledge.
If we look at the research over the past half century or so, we can see that accumulation of knowledge, that accumulation of facts does not make a small contribution. It makes an extraordinarily large contribution. So you can come up with a metaphor of the bricks in the front garden, but those bricks are important, and that knowledge is important, and they are the building blocks. And I think the way Guy is always talking about it as being something that this memorization of facts, that it's uncritical, it's the uncritical regurgitation, that absolutely, you know, when you look again at the research of this and the things that scientists are saying, when we memorize things, memorization is not the passive and uncritical process that I think Guy would have you believe. Memorization is a hugely active process. It's not the long-term memory is not a passive repository of facts. It's always envisaged as these loose, unconnected, disparate things that are floating about. And the thing I always say, you know, people often say, they say, well, you know, what's the point of knowing just this one fact or this random collection of facts? But what we know, as I say, from the research is we know that when we have these facts organised very well into schemas and we've overlearned them and we've rehearsed them so well, if you don't just know one date in history, if you know a couple of hundred and you know their relationships with each other, that's what enables your creativity, because then you see a new date, and instead of that new date just dropping into long-term memory and nothing being there, because you've got the framework, the new date and the framework in long-term memory interact. And you go, okay, well, 1825, I know what was happening then because I know that important things were happening in 1815 and 1812, but maybe 1832 and 1837 hadn't happened yet. So you're able to situate that fact in some kind of historical meaning. And the thing that allows you to have that meaning and to have that creativity and create meaning are those facts you have in long-term memory. And that if we look at, as I say, if we look at how it is that we think, and I've been very keen to talk about thinking and about creativity, we know how important all of those things are. And we know that you can have great habits of mind too, but that if you move into a sphere, into an area or a domain where you lack that, that domain knowledge, that even if you've got great habits of mind and you've got some great sort of metacognitive strategies, you'll really struggle. So the example I always give is I like to say I'm a good reader. I think I'm a good reader. I've got a degree in English literature. If you give me a poem I've never seen before, I'm able to make some pretty creative ideas about what it means. But if you give me a photocopier manual, it's still reading, but am I as good, as fluent, a creative reader? I don't think so, because I lack that domain knowledge in that area. So even though my habits of mind might be good, and I might be resilient, and I might be thinking to myself, don't get disheartened, struggle through the photocopier manual, you'll soon work out how to do that, work out that jam, that actually my lack of domain knowledge in the field of photocopier repair is going to really hold me up. So the knowledge we have is absolutely vital. And again, to come up with some more evidence, I spoke about that one about the scientists who say that long-term memory is the seat of all human intellectual skill, that also learning is now being defined by lots of scientists as a change in long-term memory. If nothing has changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. So when we consider all of that, we can, I hope, see how absolutely vital it is. And Guy mentioned Lauren Resnick. A person who I've been hugely influenced by is Herbert Simon. And Herbert Simon is an incredible man, a polymath, did research in a whole range of fields, won a Nobel Prize for his work on decision making. And Herbert Simon was the man who really revolutionised our understanding of the importance of the knowledge in long-term memory for expertise. He carried out work on chess players, on physicists, on mathematicians. And again, he said there's no shortcut to expertise, there's no shortcut to mastery. All that we know, he said, is that the expert has thousands of patterns stored in long-term memory and extensive practice at recalling those patterns in different contexts. There's no shortcut. And maybe that's the thing about this that maybe isn't that nice. But I think if that might not be nice, that there's no shortcut and we have to work hard, the really great thing is what this tells us is that everybody can succeed. That if everybody puts in that hard work in the right way, not just the experience that Gladwell talks about, but the deliberate practice that Erickson talks about, that we can all be creative, that we can build up that power in long-term memory. And that long-term memory, it's not deadening, it's not stifling, it's not the passive repository of facts that Guy would want you to believe. It's enlightening. It opens your mind. It opens up a new vista for you, and it allows you to engage in that kind of creativity. So it's not about the stifling and deadening memorisation of facts. It's about the enlightening and invigorating memorisation of facts that enables creativity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy and Daisy. OK, we now have the opportunity to address questions. Thank you very much indeed. OK, to offer a 5-minute summary, and again, I'll bang at 4 minutes just to let you know where you are. Daisy, thank you. Great.
OK, great. So, a couple of questions. So, what do I mean when I say the teacher and the pupil is subordinate to knowledge? I think what I mean by that is that it's building on that Isaac Newton point about standing on the shoulders of giants. That we live in an extraordinary, complex and sophisticated society, an extraordinary, complex and sophisticated civilization. And none of us created that on our own. It's all the inheritance, the hard-won inheritance of people that have gone before us. And one of the ancient historians I like the most, John Roberts, he said that when you look back at prehistory and you look at the painful and slow breakthroughs of early human beings, that those human beings are not innately any less smart than us. They just don't have our inherited accumulation of knowledge sitting in the bank. And we are kind of reaping the compound interest from that. So what I mean by that is we've got this vast storehouse of knowledge that's been painfully won and accumulated over centuries. It would be enormously inefficient and probably impossible for any one individual to compile that themselves in their life. So it's an important part of education to transmit that knowledge. And so that's what I mean about the teacher and the pupil being subordinate to knowledge, that we have to find a way of communicating these very powerful insights we've had. If we know things that people have known in the past that we know are the case, then as I say, the discovery method has been shown to be hugely inefficient. Jerome Bruner, who was originally a bit of a fan of it, came to that conclusion. He said the way that we're biologically adapted, it's not realistic to suppose that we are going to learn everything we need to through that pure discovery method. It isn't realistic. There has to be some kind of method of transmitting it. The second question is it realistic to develop, for individual teachers to develop this deliberate discipline practice, or should we have resources? I think we can do both. There's some resources out there doing this that I love. I mentioned the direct instruction resources by Siegfried Engelmann. Expressive writing is one of them that I've seen used, which is fantastic. It probably looks, as I say, to the outside eye, very uncreative, but I've seen it work, and I've seen it develop pupils' creative skills because it gives them that confidence to write accurately and to not have to worry about the mechanics of writing because they become so fluent and so good at it. So that's a great example, and I was pleased there was a question for Guy about methods, because I think that has been a thing that's been missing. I've given you plenty of examples of the methods I like: direct instruction, expressive writing, huge research basis behind it. Is that the kind of thing Guy would like or not? Does he think that has a role in schools? I definitely think it does. I do also think there's a role for teachers who want to develop their own routines and their own structures as well, looking at the best of what's out there too. And then the final question, how does it come about? What happens if all your pupils can do is recite facts? Again, I think this is, this is really bringing out this false dichotomy, this idea that it's just reciting facts or creativity. As I think both Guy and I have said, facts, it's not, you do need both. The difference between us is I'm saying facts are the pathway to creativity. And to illustrate that, I want to finish by talking a bit about Shakespeare, because we know quite a lot about Shakespeare's education. We know what it looked like because we have his, he went to Elizabethan grammar school, and we have the curriculum and a lot of the documents from it. And let me tell you this, and Catherine might not be pleased to hear this, but Shakespeare's school makes Michaela look progressive. Pupils had to rote learn hundreds of Latin figures of speech. You would look at it now and you would think, wow, what's going on? The knowledge was decomposed, it was decontextualised, it was utterly irrelevant to the life of a young glovemaker's son in rural 16th century Warwickshire. But just a few years after Shakespeare left school, with all these allegedly useful, decontextualised facts sloshing around in his head, he was using that knowledge in some of the most original and creative drama we've ever seen. And that wasn't an accident. It wasn't that was a reaction against his schooling. And we know this too because academics have traced his language and his use of language from the very early plays like The Two Gentlemen of Verona, where the use of metaphor and some of these techniques is quite clunky. And then through to the brilliantly confident usage of them in the later plays such as Hamlet and Julius Caesar, where he's mastered the rules and going on to break them. And that's not an isolated example either. The late 16th, early 17th century saw a huge flowering of such dramatic talent, many of those playwrights with the same background as Shakespeare, the Elizabethan grammar school, which, as I say, we've got the curriculum for. And when you look at creative geniuses in other fields, in other eras, you find something similar. There's a great line I think Dan Willingham likes to use by a geologist, where he says, the best geologist is the one who's seen the most rocks. Okay? Creative genius arises out of memorisation and practice. Like many great truths, I think this one is counterintuitive. Innovation arises from tradition, and the methods of traditional schooling are the best hope we have of developing the creativity pupils need to face the challenges of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, and to summarise for his side, Guy Claxton.
Okay, thank you very much. Teaching methods. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I think the work that I've been doing, and I think that Ken is interested in, is trying to articulate in more detail what it is that lies behind creativity or being a powerful learner, and that gives us a greater range of different teaching methods that we can use. And I don't mind whether you call them traditional or progressive. What I'm interested in is whether the way we teach is connected with the kinds of minds that we think will flourish in the 21st century. Some of you may know, just to give you a little example, that about 2 months ago I got into trouble by having, when I was speaking to the education editor of the Daily Telegraph, he said, that's all very well, but give me a practical example. And I said, well, from certain points of view, when they're used in certain kinds of ways, erasers can be instruments of the devil. Now, this was ill-judged, this phrase, but there's some sense behind it. It's not helpful in schools if you teach in a way that trains young people to think that being bright or intelligent means being able to give the right answer to everything, always, quickly, without making mistakes. Because I don't know about your life, but in my life, most worthwhile learning arises from trial and error and frustration and getting upset and having another go and working your way towards something that is a worthwhile answer to the problem that you've solved yourself. So it is miseducation if we're encouraging youngsters to be, as it were, ashamed of mistakes because they've been led to think that that means they're stupid or that means they're less intelligent. If erasers are used as a way of purveying that idea in a classroom, young people become more timid and less adventurous and less resilient in their learning than they need to be. Now, that's not wishy-washy, child-centered stuff. That's factually the case. Of course, lots of people use erasers, designers and artists and what have you, but they use them without them coming with that underlying belief system, if you like. So this is nothing that I'm talking about is progressive in the sense of liberal or child-centered. It's about having a good look at, do we think that young people are going to need to be interested in struggling with things that are difficult? That's what we call resilience. Do you think they're going to have the kinds of minds that are going to be able to come up with fresh ideas when they need them? That's what we call creativity. Do we think they need to have the kinds of minds that are open to feedback and critique from other people to help them get better at what they're doing? That's called open-mindedness. If we do, then there are methods that we can use in school that are deliberately aimed either towards building those mental attitudes or away from building those mental attitudes. So I think that we need to look at everything that we teach in school. Yes, the tutors might be of value. You could argue that the tutors or trigonometry or ionic and covalent bonding is absolutely vital for all young people to know. I think there's an awful lot of the curriculum that we could ask questions about. But we need to look at the content from 2 points of view. Is it valuable in its own right? And we can have a vigorous argument about that. But also, what kinds of mental attitudes and habits are being strengthened or required or legitimated by the way that information is being used? If all you do is memorize, you're practicing memorization. If what you do also is to have a critical attitude towards the information that you're reading, to learn to be able to manage your own attention, which is a very important skill in the 21st century, to be someone who is good at helping a team work effectively, which, according to the CBI and dozens of other authorities, are vital skills for people in the workplace. If all of these different aspects of the mental ensemble, so to speak, are of genuine validity for young people for the rest of their lives, then we ought to be being more creative, more imaginative about helping them develop them. And to be also doing those things in a way that helps as many of them as possible get the best grades as possible and learn the knowledge that we consider to be vital for an educated person in the 21st century. Daisy keeps slipping back into either-orness. I want it all-ness. And a big part of the all is understanding that minds are collections of habits which we educate for good or ill in our classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you. Because you guys were so wonderfully disciplined with your questions, we actually have time to take a couple more. We'll just address them to individuals and then they can answer if that's all right. Is that okay?
Kevin, I totally agree with you. I really do. And I think, actually, paradoxically, that what you're talking about has come about, this teaching to the test, it's come about because of the misconceived methods that are being promoted by people like Sir Ken. Because if you think that creativity or any skill is developed directly just by doing stuff, that leads to teaching to the test. So if you think that the way to become a good creative writer is just to do lots of creative writing, that's where you get into the thing of people saying, right, well, we just need to keep doing the exam because that will make us better at the exam. So I think that this teaching to the test that you deplore and I deplore has come about because people think that if you just do exam, you get better at the exam. And what I'm talking about is that deliberate practice where you unpick what is needed and you teach that and build it up, and sometimes it looks nothing like the exam. There are things that will make you so much better at doing an exam that don't look anything like it. Just as there are things that will make you so much more creative but don't look like, for example, you know, lying on the floor, staring at the clouds and dreaming. Okay? So there are lots of things which don't look like they'll make you better at something, but they will. And I think the reason we fall into this teaching to the test is because we've forgotten that. We've forgotten that you have to unpick the skill and see what lies underneath it. So, you know, Guy's telling you it's an either or and he wants it all. I want it all too. I want all the skills he's talked about. I want creativity. I want collaboration. I just have a different way of getting there. And I would say that Guy's way and Sir Ken's way, paradoxically, leads to the kind of teaching to the test that you and I rightly deplore.
Yeah, I'll stand up here. Of course, there are differences between novice and experts, but in terms of the way each of them goes about learning, there are enormous similarities. Someone who's learning beginnings of football, it's like learning is moving out from what you can currently do and understand. It's operating at the edge of your current level of capacity and understanding. That's the way I see learning. It's not adding another brick to the wall. So, and we are all in that process. I've written about 30 books and I'm a novice writer. I'm still learning the craft of writing. I'm still experimenting. I'm still pushing myself in terms of the kinds of voice that I can use, I would hope. Everybody else is still, you know, you can go to a gymnasium and people are working on machines at different levels of expertise, but they're all working in what sports psychologists will call the sweet spot, a point where you're being stretched, but you feel as if you're making progress. It's that kind of dynamic state that underpins learning, which I don't hear anything of in the worldview of Daisy and her friends. What I'm very interested in is learning as stretching your current capacity to know, to be able to do, and to understand, and to be able to build on that. And that applies to all of us, I think. And the other question about school is, of course, it's always a contested question about balance. How do we balance helping youngsters do as well on the tests as they can and developing their ability to be independent and self-reliant? How do we balance the fostering of mental skills and habits? A Harvard psychologist has written a very good book called In Over Our Heads, The Mental Demands of Modern Life, in which he articulates very clearly the kinds of mental capacities, the kinds of minds that will flourish in the kind of world that the mid-21st century is going to be. And if we're going to help education to be as appropriate and as effective as it can be, we need to drill down into what that means and do everything we can to help children learn to move forward. It may be that Shakespeare's mind was filled with lots of constructions and so on, but there are also millions of young people whose brains have been dulled and deadened by a diet of constant memorization. Just being able to pull out a few examples of people who retained their creativity despite a Grindian approach to education doesn't make the case. We need to think a bit more subtly than that. Thank you.